Hi, I'm David Bowie, and you're watching DeeJay Television.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure.
Recently, you've written a lot of songs for films, Absolute Beginners, more recently, When the Wind Blows. Do you find it easier now to get your ideas from other people's images? I mean, it's like a break for you?
It's been I've never attempted it before the last 5 or 6 years, but having not really wanted to write much for myself until I collected my thoughts, it seemed like a fun exercise to keep doing it for a while. And I admire very much the films of, well, I think Julian Temple is going to be one of our better filmmakers.
Yeah,
and
fantastic.
do you like his things?
Yeah.
Well, that's great, good.
Well, the
And
video
so
you just
I
did for
wanted very
years
much to
on
contribute to that. So that was a lot of fun. And then there was an animation thing in England called When the Wind Blows, which was based on a series of comic strips.
Raymond Briggs.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
I haven't seen it, but I know of it.
It's
a
tremendous effort, and it's very sad, it's very poignant. It's based on the idea of what does an elderly couple do when faced with a nuclear crisis, and they have to adhere to the rules in the government handbook about putting up doors against walls and taking in pints of water, and that will save them through the fallout.
What a drag.
And this is the real advice that is given by the British government to people for when there is a nuclear bomb drop. So it's a very sad, tragic movie. Yeah. And I wrote a rural little song for that.
Yeah, here he is. Avenger's partner is coming out there.
I wrote a theme song for that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I like it a lot. It's a shame the movie didn't come out here, though. And
it's not out yet.
No,
Yeah, I think it should be out later this year.
Yeah. I know that you're pretty well-read, and you give the impression of, yes, you are.
I read a lot.
40 books a day, I heard. I envy you.
God,
I wish I could do that.
No more than 30.
You also give the impression of being quite intellectual, if I may say
No,
so.
I'm not at all. Not at all intellectual. I'm far more intuitive.
I was going to ask if your songwriting is based
I'm
on intellect or on instinct. And
that's an answer.
Okay.
It is purely intuitive. I'm smart, but I'm not bright.
You're modest.
That makes sense. I'm a good dancer.
Yes.
Mentally, I dance more than I think.
So with the single Day In, Day Out, that was based on something inside of your heart instinct. You saw something that made you angry, because it speaks up, I should say, for them.
Yeah, well,
poverty
over the last few months we've been inundated with video and television messages of what's happening to the underprivileged apart from the African countries, but in our own domestic situations.
Oh, yeah.
In the big cities, in both England, here, of course.
America.
And especially in America,
Yes,
where it's nearly unrivaled now. And it seemed to be daunting that so much focusing was on the interaction between the Western and the USSR governments, and that the domestic problems seemed to be swept under the carpet. There seemed to be a degree of uncaring about that situation. It's just something I focused in fairly radically on this album, for me radically, because I'm not particularly didactic. I'm much more of an impressionist, surrealist. Sort of, I don't make singular statements as much as...
Except for Loving the Alien.
Yeah, that was, well, that's fairly near to a stark, one message statement, yeah. That's very good.
We'll get into that later.
Well as being
I've got a whole list of things I want to ask.
As well as being an extraordinarily attractive young lady, you're very bright.
Oh, God. You're trying to throw me off, huh?
Not at all. That's the last thing I'd want to do.
Thank you. The video, speaking of being radical, with Julian Temple, you did the video.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I found it very difficult to watch in certain places, being a woman. It was so violent.
Yes,
there was no compassion. Even at the end, excuse my language, and you have the fuck food mom, right?
Yeah.
That was done on purpose, obviously.
I made it as rarely do I do a linear narrative piece of work. I mean, my stuff does often go off at tangents, or it's a collection of fragmentations, but I wanted something with a fairly strong narrative form for this piece, because I wanted to be fairly straightforward about what I was talking about in the song. And I usually try and make the weight of the video the same weight as the song.
Yeah.
And this particular one did call for a savage, muscular approach to it, and the situation in Los Angeles I found to be as weird and as bad as anywhere else that I've ever been. The homeless that are used in the video are in fact homeless on the streets of Los Angeles, and they had formed them, so the particular people that we used had formed themselves into a theatre group to protest what was going on among themselves. It was a way of them vocalizing their dissatisfaction with the way that they're treated. And this is starting to happen in Los Angeles and in New York, is that they're starting to bond together to become, and they usually have one radical leader who becomes the spearhead for their group.
Right.
And they are taking some physical action against the inaction that's taken over them.
Physical action? In
Yeah.
what way physical action?
Well, they're
Violent
invading
action?
civic halls and demanding to be let in overnight when it's cold, for instance, and they're getting in. And there was a huge thing in Los Angeles about that, where they got their way, and they allowed 300 or 400 of them to live in Civic Hall,
Right.
whilst the season was very cold on the streets of Los Angeles, whereas last year they were just dying off everywhere.
Why have you decided to start writing more about social problems that we talked about before? There was Living the Alien, but on this album,
yeah,
excuse me, there was
it's been
87
growing
and
with
Cry,
me. It's not really
Time
been,
Will Crawl.
Yeah.
And there are a couple on this album.
Yeah, it's not really been a conscious move. It just, I think probably, I have to think about that. I guess when,
Take your
from when
time.
from when I stopped writing characters for myself as stage,
Yeah.
I moved into music with Brian Eno.
Yes.
I'm going to
Great,
break up
Brian Eno.
laughing in a minute. I can't help it. I'm
Why?
sorry. I can't say. And I started writing music with Brian Eno, and it was more or less of ambient nature, very much in the Eno area. And I guess it was a vacuum intellectually for me.
That was in Berlin, I'm
yeah,
sorry. Right.
Yeah, because it was just a re-evaluation of what I wanted to do. And coming out of that, I gradually got more and more into narrative writing, whereas before it was very fragmented.
Right.
And the responses to my writing have been from within me as opposed to feeding back from the cities that I was in. Because I would normally find a city that I found very exciting and go and live there and then write from being in that city.
Right.
Whatever was happening out on the streets would come back in on me, and I would write about it. But this time, a lot of this album comes from a well of my own emotional responses to things. It's not quite as cold and supposedly objective as some of my previous material has been. It's a little more subjective. It even touches things like romance, which for me were almost an unknown and mysterious subject to me in terms of a writer. I could never write clear-headedly about that.
Right.
But now that's starting to become almost a possible subject.
Well, there are no
area.
slow songs, though. But there are, like you said, love songs. Shining Star, Never
Yeah.
Let Me Down, which is the
Yeah.
title of the album. Then there's the metaphorical Beat on Your Drum.
Yeah.
I love that song.
Yeah. It's a sort of,
Brilliant, yeah.
it was a Lolita-esque thing. It was, yeah.
The Nabokov,
Yeah,
yeah. I knew that was going to come out. Like, isn't that what Labyrinth is a bit about also? Kind of a fairy tale?
Oh, I think that was
Lolita?
in Jim Henson's mind. It was certainly in my mind whilst
Yeah.
we were making it. I thought that was probably a plausible subtext to what he was doing, but Jim had a lot of ideas going in that movie. I think maybe one too many, but it came a bit jumbly for me. But it was fun to do, I guess. It wasn't my favourite fun to do.
What is your favourite? I have to ask them.
I quite like doing a cameo role in a film by John Landis called Into the Night.
Oh, yeah. I know the music.
just
I haven't seen it.
It's just a little gangster role that I had. It's only about 5 minutes long, but it's one of my favourite roles. I also like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. I enjoyed that one very much.
Sakamoto.
Oh, he's absolutely extraordinary.
Unbelievable.
You're wild about him, are you?
Well,
I shall
half
let him know.
Japanese, so...
Yes, I
Yeah.
thought so.
Anyway, you said before that you write things now from the
Yeah.
inside out.
Yeah.
What about religion, astrology also? Religion, what kind of effect?
Not
you used to wear that
particularly.
cross, that's
I
why
still
I'm asking
wear
you.
it. I still
Then you
have it.
wrote Loving the Alien, I keep using that as a
Yeah.
focal point, sorry.
Yeah.
But I've got
Well,
one too.
Loving the Alien, which was I like that song and that video very much indeed. I mean, it was just, again, I was just assessing only for myself, not for anybody else's benefit, but the problems that seem always to have been inherent with the Christian and Muslim religions, and it was the continual regarding each other as aliens, and that it's extraordinary how still in this 20th century that religions can keep people so far apart. If it's not a political polemic, then it's a religious one, and that's it's so unfortunate. And my particular, if I have any religious background, which is not very strong, I was brought up as an Anglican of the Church of England, but I sort of drifted into Buddhism when I was about 18, and I was Buddhist for 15 or 16 minutes.
You dabbled in it, yeah.
Like every teenager, I guess.
Yes.
But one thing that did stay with me, apart from I made a couple of very good friends who were Tibetan Buddhists, who were living over in London at the time. Apart from that, one thing that did stay with me was a sense of transience, and that manifest objects really are nothing